atingiu um prédio no centro da cidade de Gaza. O apresentador disse para a repórter.
Wars aren't just about clashes on a battlefield. They happen in ruined cities, in families torn apart, and in the lost future of children growing up surrounded by fear. But what's the true price of a conflict? Today, we're looking at the impact of war that goes far beyond destruction stats. We're talking about lives cut short, the massive psychological and economic toll, and how each explosion sends shockwaves across the entire planet. If you've ever felt war was a distant issue, get ready to rethink that. Let's start with a crucial point. War isn't just about tanks, planes, bombs, and soldiers in trenches. It's also about families forced to abandon their homes, kids who lose access to school for years, and ordinary people who only wanted to work but end up drafted to the front lines. In fact, it's not just those holding guns who experience war. The people trapped in besieged cities also suffer in countless ways. Today, we're talking about what wars really cost us, not just in dollars or any other currency, but in human lives, mental health, and the potential for progress. And let's be honest, some losses can't be tallied, they can only be mourned. Now, before we dive into these staggering numbers, let's make one thing clear. This isn't about pointing fingers or labelling who's the hero or the villain. Our goal is to look coldly at the facts and yet remain empathetic about the human stories behind them. Yes, it's tough to swallow that our species still finds it acceptable to settle disputes by firing projectiles, but it's exactly this kind of brutality that reminds us we desperately need an ethical and moral evolution, plus a healthy dose of common sense. If we're not willing to believe in that possibility, we might as well grab the popcorn and wait for the next war. Speaking of current conflicts, when many of us think war, we immediately picture Ukraine, which dominated headlines starting in 2022 with harrowing images that feel ripped from a World War II documentary. And for good reason. According to UN data, by mid-2023, it was estimated that over 9,000 civilians had been killed. That's just the official figure. Reality could be much higher. Around 14 million people were forced to leave their homes, either temporarily or for good. Imagine that, as if almost the entire population of a medium-sized European nation just packed up and left. This particular conflict is a clear example of how war dismantles everything. Destroyed civilian infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools, power plants, entire cities without electricity or water, constant shortages of fuel. And of course, there's the global economic fallout. Just look at rising food prices, higher energy costs, and shaky international trade agreements. The global economy, already limping from the pandemic, took yet another hit. It's that old saying, when one country sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. With war, it feels like we're all running a fever, and it doesn't stop there. One of the world's most overlooked conflicts is still raging in Yemen, often called the worst humanitarian crisis on Earth. Since the civil war escalated in 2015, nearly 400,000 people have died, directly or indirectly, due to violence, hunger, and disease. Indirect deaths are caused by lack of clean water, sanitation, and medical care. According to the UN, roughly 80% of Yemen's population needs some form of humanitarian aid. Think about that. In a group of 100 people, 80 are in dire need. That level of human and social devastation shows how war can be a slow-motion destroyer of worlds. Syria is another bitter example. That conflict has dragged on for more than a decade, with estimates exceeding 350,000 casualties and millions of refugees fleeing to neighbouring countries or scattered across Europe. Remember the surge of Syrian refugees into Europe in 2015 to 2016. It sparked sympathy, but also provoked heated political debates. Many who once claimed to welcome those in need began pushing for stricter immigration policies. Meanwhile, families got stuck in refugee camps with no clear future. We like to call ourselves empathetic, yet often we turn our backs when refugees show up at our doorstep. Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, these aren't the only war zones. There are serious conflicts in Africa as well, including Ethiopia's Tigray region, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and more. But these few examples are enough to grasp the scale of the loss. And by loss, I don't just mean financial costs. I'm talking about the stunted development of entire nations, and by extension, the entire world. Countries forced to divert huge sums towards security and defence end up neglecting education, healthcare, and civil infrastructure. And let's face it, a child who never learns to read or write can't grow into an adult who contributes to social and economic progress. Remember too that the arms industry makes billions of dollars every year. In 2022 alone, global military spending reached about $2.24 trillion, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. That's such a gigantic figure, it's almost impossible to visualise. It's larger than the combined GDPs of many countries. Now imagine if that amount went to scientific research, disease prevention, and quality education. It's painful to think about how far we'd have come if those resources weren't spent on tanks, missiles, and drones. In an attempt not to make this conversation completely grim, let's add a dash of irony. Sometimes it feels like humanity has evolved in nearly every area: powerful smartphones, artificial intelligence, cutting-edge medical tech. But when it comes to settling geopolitical disputes, we're still stuck in the Stone Age. Sure, we've traded spears and catapults for long-range artillery and missiles, but the principle is the same: resolving differences by who can strike hardest. What does that say about us as a species? Maybe it's time to rethink our priorities. Speaking of priorities, there's a fundamental aspect we often overlook when discussing the cost of war: the psychological impact that echoes across generations. Children growing up in conflict zones suffer deep trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety. They witness their homes destroyed, their loved ones killed, the entire world turned upside down. Can you imagine what that does to their sense of safety and hope? And even in countries that win a war, countless families welcome home soldiers who are traumatized, scarred and haunted by what they've seen and done. The heroic image painted by government propaganda can mask the silent anguish that follows. Wars don't stay confined behind borders either. They spread like a virus through financial markets, international politics, and immigration policies. Economic sanctions, for instance, create new tensions and often harm civilian sectors that had nothing to do with their leaders' decisions. In this giant chessboard we call international relations, everyday people are the pawns. So the question is, how many more pawns must be sacrificed before we realise chess is not meant to be played with human lives? We also can't ignore the assault on personal freedoms and free speech that often accompanies wartime. In conflict zones, governments tend to tighten laws, control the media, and silence dissenting voices in the name of national security. Anyone who calls for peace can be branded a traitor or face severe retaliation. It's the usual script. First you muzzle people, then you suppress ideas, and eventually you stifle an entire population. Sadly, war often provides the perfect excuse for authoritarian practices that linger long after the fighting stops. On that note, another grim fact is that an official end to a conflict doesn't necessarily mark the end of its destruction. Farmland is sometimes rendered useless for decades due to landmines. Urban areas need massive rebuilding efforts, which cost more than it took to demolish them in the first place. Undetonated ordnance remains buried underground, ready to explode if someone takes a wrong step. And then there's the immense environmental damage: fuel spills, heavy metals, and chemical residues from munitions. Even once the last bullet is fired, a silent war against these lingering effects continues. And of course, war also poisons relationships among peoples. Collective resentment can last for generations, blocking dialogue and fueling mutual distrust. It fractures what could have been shared progress. Groups that once coexisted drift apart. International cooperation projects fall through. Fear replaces hope. Competition replaces collaboration. We stay stuck in an us versus them mindset instead of coming together to face global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and extreme poverty. It might sound naive, but if we poured our collective ingenuity into solving problems rather than creating them, we'd be miles ahead as a civilization. Think of all the brilliant minds lost on the battlefield, all the scientific breakthroughs that never happened, all the masterpieces that were destroyed. We'll never know what humanity might have achieved if we chose to exchange knowledge instead of bullets. The cultural and scientific losses from each conflict may well be immeasurable because we can't measure what was never given the chance to exist. Now, here's a little sarcasm for you. As a species, we like to say we're not as barbaric as we used to be. But if you think back to medieval times, the weapons were rudimentary, and it took much longer to inflict total ruin. Today, a single button can wipe entire cities off the map, not to mention the nuclear shadow that's hung over us since the end of World War II. It's as if we've channeled all our technological prowess into finding new ways to destroy ourselves. Nicely done, humanity. Meanwhile, we live in a world where some people wear t-shirts preaching peace, while simultaneously tracking wars like sports championships, rooting for one side or the other, forgetting that real lives are at stake. Disappointment sets in when we realise there's no genuine winner in war, only varying degrees of loser. And guess who loses the most? The civilian population that never asked for any of this. Speaking of civilians, one of the biggest casualties is education. Prolonged conflicts disrupt the schooling of entire generations. School buildings become shelters or get demolished. Teachers flee or are killed, so kids learn how to handle weapons instead of math and history. That's the legacy of war. Knowledge stalls, talent goes to waste, and opportunities evaporate. And once the dust settles, rebuilding an entire education system from scratch is a massive challenge. We talk a lot about sustainable development, but without education, there's no real progress. End of story. From an infrastructure standpoint, the material damage of war can reach billions of dollars, depending on how long the fighting lasts. That money doesn't magically reappear afterward. Countries often have to rely on investment, international loans, or humanitarian aid. War-torn nations end up in debt, lose political standing, and sometimes become hotbeds for future instability. It's a vicious cycle. A country that gets bombed today might, without global help, turn into the next powder keg a few years down the road. And here's a human appeal. When we talk about material damage, we have to remember that every destroyed bridge was someone's route to work or a path to visit relatives. Every demolished building was someone's home, filled with memories, or perhaps a cultural centre where communities gathered. We shouldn't reduce it all to X million dollars of damage. That's a cold statistic that leaves out the tears and desperation of people watching their birthplace turn to rubble. Human suffering is what really matters, and there's no price tag for that. So what's the end game? If, after all the bloodshed, adversaries eventually sit down and negotiate an agreement, often the very one they could have discussed beforehand, why not start with diplomacy? But we know war is fueled by political, territorial, economic, ideological interests, and of course, nationalistic pride. As long as those factors exist, some will believe pulling the trigger is easier than shaking hands for a deal. Unfortunately, it's rare to hear a government publicly admit that war is usually the worst solution. Have you ever noticed how wars are typically declared by a tiny fraction of the population, but the vast majority ends up paying the price? A leader, a general, a security council. Rarely does the public get a direct say in choosing war. It's often a power move, sometimes driven by ego. Meanwhile, ordinary people live in fear, follow orders, and pray to survive. They wonder why international politics didn't find a better way. This disconnect between leaders and their people explains why wars can feel endless. The ones giving orders rarely shoulder the same risks as those who carry them out. We can't ignore the role of media in all of this. Coverage can either put a human face on conflicts or turn them into spectacles. Sometimes a war is spotlighted in Western media, like Ukraine, while others remain hidden or forgotten, like Yemen. That uneven focus shapes our perception and creates a hierarchy of whose lives matter. The conflict that gets primetime coverage is the one people talk about. Everything else fades into obscurity. This imbalance leads to a global audience that only reacts when war is front and centre on the nightly news. All of this is why today's conversation is so important. We need to do more than learn the numbers. We have to empathise with the people behind those stats. When I say 10,000 people were killed, it can sound like an abstract figure. But if I tell you it included a father who loved reading bedtime stories, a grandmother who cherished her garden, or a young scientist researching cures for rare diseases, your perspective changes. Every life lost in war is a universe of possibilities that disappears, a piece of our collective potential that's gone forever. Ultimately, the cost of war is enormous in every sense. And amidst this tangled web of consequences, there's something no official report can quantify. The erosion of our humanity. Every time we choose violence as an answer, we drift further from that ideal of civilization we proudly talk about. We pour resources into tanks instead of mines, teach kids how to dodge explosions instead of building bridges of understanding. When everything is destroyed, we start over from the rubble, still not sure if we've learned our lesson. At the end of the day, looking at conflicts everywhere, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, or anywhere else, it's impossible not to see war as a colossal waste of resources, of time, of lives, of potential. The numbers are vast and feel impersonal, but together they represent our collective failure to solve disagreements in a civilized way. Yes, there are layers of complexity and countless interests at play, but if we took a step back, we might realise we're all in the same boat. And every time we punch holes in that boat, wherever they may be, we all risk sinking. If this topic made you think, hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to join this conversation. We'd love to know. Do you believe humanity can still find peaceful solutions to its conflicts? Drop a comment and add your voice to this essential discussion. And of course, subscribe to our channel for deeper dives into the issues that truly matter.